The first thing they found was his radio, cracked and smeared with something dark. Then, his hat torn and soaked from the previous night's rain. They never found him. And the last transmission from the old ranger cabin, a single whisper crackling through the static. It knows. Hello all, thank you for tuning in, but before we get into the story, 91% of you watching aren't subscribed. If you enjoy these creepy tales, take a second to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Let me know where you're listening from or what story you want next. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's get into this week's episode. Daniel Whitaker had always loved the outdoors. That's why he took the job. A park ranger position at Mark Twain National Forest, deep in the Missouri Ozarks, sounded like the perfect way to escape the city and breathe fresh air for a living. He wasn't naive. He knew the job meant long hours, unpredictable weather, and the occasional lost hiker. But none of that deterred him. What no one told him was why the position had opened up. His first day at the ranger station smelled like fresh coffee, damp flannel, and rain-soaked earth. The walls were lined with old maps, outdated equipment, and missing persons reports pinned to a corkboard near the back. Some of them were decades old, the edges yellowed and curling. Others looked fresh, their ink barely dry. Daniel ran a finger over one at random. Jacob Ellis, Park Ranger, last seen October 12th. Ellis was the guy before me, wasn't he? Daniel asked, turning toward the small group of rangers seated around the table. A long pause. Then, Ranger Dawson, the grizzled veteran who had been introduced as his supervisor, handed him a laminated sheet of paper. "Read this," Dawson said, his voice gravelly and low. "And follow it. Don't ask questions." Daniel frowned, but took the paper. 5 simple rules were printed in bold letters across the top. Rules for night patrol. 1. Lock the cabin door before sundown. Once it's dark, do not open it until morning, not for anything. 2. If you hear something calling your name from the trees, ignore it. It's not me. It's not anyone. 3. The radio may pick up voices. Do not reply unless you hear Ranger Dawson first. 4. If you see a man standing at the tree line with no flashlight, don't acknowledge him. Don't look twice. 5. If you wake up to find the front door open, leave immediately. Do not pack your things. Just run. Daniel let out a short laugh. "You messing with the new guy?" Dawson didn't smile. Another ranger, Carson, glanced up from where she was cleaning her shotgun at the table. She gave Daniel a look that was almost sympathetic. "Just follow the damn rules." Daniel hesitated, waiting for someone to crack a grin and admit it was an initiation prank. But no one did. "You're stationed at the old Firewatch cabin tonight," Dawson continued. "Make the hour-long hike before sundown. And Daniel paused. Keep the door locked." It wasn't until he was halfway up the trail, backpack slung over one shoulder, that he realized no one had answered his question. Why had the position opened up? The path to the Firewatch cabin wound through dense woods, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in fractured beams, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the deeper he went, the quieter it became. At first, it was the good kind of quiet, the kind that came with being surrounded by nature, away from the hum of city life. But after a while, it started to feel off, like the forest was holding its breath. Birdsong faded. The occasional rustle in the brush stopped entirely. Even his own footsteps felt muffled, swallowed by the thick carpet of leaves. His grip tightened on the flashlight in his pack. He was being ridiculous. It was just nerves. First day jitters. Still, he picked up the pace. When he finally saw the Firewatch cabin through the trees, a weight lifted off his shoulders. It was an old structure, but sturdy, perched atop a small ridge with a decent view of the valley below. A radio antenna jutted from the roof, and a single rocking chair sat on the front porch, swaying slightly in the breeze. At least, he thought it was the breeze. He swallowed, shaking off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. Just the wind. Just the forest, settling. Still, when he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the first thing he did was slide the deadbolt into place, just in case. Daniel settled into the cabin as the sun dipped below the treetops, casting long shadows across the valley. He switched on the battery-powered lantern, its dim yellow light barely illuminating the single-room interior. Just a cot, a desk, and an old two-way radio crackling softly with static. The place smelled of aged wood and dust, with a faint lingering scent of something else, something metallic. He checked his watch. 8:37 p.m. His shift had officially begun. Dawson had said to check in every hour. Daniel twisted the radio's dial, listening as the static wavered. "Fire watch cabin to base. All quiet so far." A pause. Then Dawson's voice came through, a little fuzzier than before. "Copy that. Keep it that way." Daniel leaned back in the chair, listening to the sounds of the night. Or rather, the lack of them. The woods outside were deathly silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Then, knock, knock. Daniel's breath hitched. It wasn't the front door. The sound had come from outside, near the window. Slow, deliberate taps against the glass. Knock. Knock. His pulse spiked. It's just the trees shifting in the wind. That was the logical explanation. The only explanation. Except, there was no wind. He swallowed hard and reached for his flashlight, the rules flashing in his mind. Keep the door locked. Don't open it for anything. Daniel forced himself to stay seated, listening. The knocking had stopped, but the silence felt thicker now, pressing in against the cabin walls. Then, something new. A voice, faint, distant, calling his name. Daniel. His spine went rigid. It was coming from the trees, low and familiar, almost like... Dawson? Daniel fumbled for the radio. "Base, you out there?" Static. He turned the dial, trying again. "Dawson?" "Neil." The voice came through the radio this time, warped and stretched, like a cassette tape playing too slow. "Daniel." His throat went dry. That wasn't Dawson. It wasn't anyone. The firewatch cabin had a small back window. He turned toward it instinctively. Something was standing at the tree line. It was just a silhouette in the darkness, tall and thin, with limbs too long to be human. The moment his eyes landed on it, it moved, melting back into the trees without a sound. Daniel's breath came fast and shallow. His fingers were numb against the radio. Then the knocking started again. Closer this time. Knock, knock, knock. From the front door. 9:12 p.m. Daniel hadn't moved from the chair in over 20 minutes. His muscles were locked, his ears straining for any hint of sound outside. The knocking had stopped, but that didn't make him feel better. The radio crackled. "Daniel?" His blood ran cold. It was Dawson's voice, or at least, it sounded like him. He grabbed the radio. "Dawson, something's outside." Silence. Then, "Open the door." A wave of ice washed through Daniel's veins. Rule number 1, lock the cabin door before sundown. Once it's dark, do not open it until morning. Not for anything. His grip on the radio tightened. "Dawson, if that's really you, tell me something only you'd know." Silence again. Then, in that same slow, distorted voice, "Daniel." He dropped the radio. Outside, footsteps circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was testing the walls. Then came the worst sound of all, the click of the front door unlocking. Daniel's stomach flipped. He hadn't touched the lock. And yet, the deadbolt slid open, all on its own. The handle turned. He lunged for his flashlight, aiming it at the door just as it creaked open an inch, just enough for the darkness outside to stare back at him. Daniel didn't breathe, didn't blink. The door did not move any further. Then, the rocking chair on the porch creaked. The voice, low and breathy, whispered right outside the door frame. "Found you." Daniel's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the crack in the door, wide-eyed, trying to force himself to move, to do anything. The voice outside the door had been a death knell, its chilling whisper seeming to echo around the cabin, the very air thick with something malignant. "Found you." The door creaked, as if some invisible hand were pushing against it, a slow, torturous movement that made Daniel's limbs feel like lead. He had to move. He had to get out. But the rules, his mind repeated the rules like a mantra. Leave immediately if the door opens. Don't pack anything. Just run. But how? How could he leave when whatever was out there was already here? Daniel's throat tightened and panic clawed at him. Then, footsteps. They were light, quick, like the tapping of bare feet against the floorboards of the porch. His pulse sped up. The sound moved toward the window. His flashlight flickered in his hands, casting a dim, erratic light over the walls of the cabin. He dared a glance out the window, just a glimpse, and saw it. A figure, tall, gaunt, its silhouette just barely visible in the shadows. It wasn't a man anymore. Whatever it was had shifted. Its limbs were longer, too long to be human. The hands were reaching, groping at the wall, the window, desperate to get inside. And then, the door handle turned again. Number no. The door was barely open, but there was something behind it now, something waiting. The chair outside groaned as if it had been rocked forward by the invisible force, and the very foundation of the cabin felt as if it were vibrating with tension. Then, the whisper came again. Close, so close, like it was breathing down his neck, a sound as jagged as broken glass, each word feeling like a cold hand on his skin. "Let me in, Daniel." It knows. His eyes darted around the room, his gaze catching on the radio. The damn radio that had been useless, its transmission crackling and warping. But now it might be his only lifeline. He threw himself toward it, his breath coming in frantic bursts, fingers fumbling over the buttons. "Dawson!" Daniel shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "Please, it's here! Help me!" The radio crackled once more, the static almost deafening. "Daniel!" But it wasn't Dawson. It was something else. The voice was deeper now, layered, as if several people, no, things, were speaking in unison. The sound slithered through the air like something alive. He didn't wait to hear more. His eyes darted to the front door again, just in time to see it creep open a little further. The darkness outside growing bolder, pushing into the cabin like a living thing. That was all it took. Daniel couldn't stay. Grabbing his flashlight, he bolted toward the back door, but as he reached for the handle, something stopped him. A cold presence. A figure, tall, skeletal, loomed in the doorway. It was there, blocking his escape. The air grew thicker, suffocating him. He could barely breathe. His pulse felt like it was vibrating his whole body. That thing, it wasn't just outside anymore. It was in his mind. It knows. It knew him. It knew his fear. He spun around, his flashlight now casting shaky, wild beams across the room. The chair. The damn chair. It was rocking again, on its own. He took a step back, and then another. He was cornered. The rules, his mind screamed. Run. But where? The tree line outside was now a blur of shifting shadows, its edges pulsing with an unnatural rhythm, as if waiting for him to make the wrong move. Run. He wasn't thinking. He wasn't listening to reason. He grabbed the back door, ripped it open, and stumbled into the night. Cold, wet, silent. The forest stretched out before him, vast and unwelcoming. but Daniel didn't care anymore. His legs moved on their own, pushing him forward, away from the cabin, away from the thing that was hunting him. He had one shot, just one, to make it back to the ranger station. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The howl of something inhuman split the night air, echoing across the woods, and Daniel felt it in his bones. It was following him. He ran faster, the trees blurring around him as he tripped over roots and jagged rocks. His breath was ragged, his chest aching with every step, but he didn't slow down. Through the forest he ran, every shadow a possible threat, every rustle a promise of something creeping just behind him. Suddenly, a crack, a low, guttural sound, came from just beyond his line of sight. He didn't dare stop. He couldn't stop. But then, the whisper again, a breath, cold against his ear. "Found you." Daniel whipped around but saw nothing. He was alone. And then, just ahead, the familiar outline of the ranger station. His heart thundered in his chest, and his feet moved quicker, propelling him toward the station's lights, to safety, to the place where the ground beneath his feet gave way. His body dropped into darkness, swallowed by the earth, and everything went black. Daniel's eyes snapped open, and for a moment, he didn't know where he was. His body felt numb, heavy, as though it had been dragged through the mud. His breath was shallow, his heart pounding erratically, each thump sending tremors through his chest. He was lying on the ground. No, not just any ground. The air was thick, heavy, with an almost unnatural stillness. The air tasted of earth, of moss, of something decayed. He struggled to sit up, his hands sinking into soft, wet soil. His flashlight was gone, the faint outline of the ranger station nowhere to be seen. Everything was dark. A low growl echoed through the trees. Daniel froze. It wasn't far. He could feel it, its presence, like a shadow stretching across his soul, crawling under his skin. He couldn't remember how he had fallen, but he had to get up. He had to move. The rules were clear now. Never stop. Never look back. His body screamed in protest as he pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaky beneath him. The forest around him was eerily silent. No wind, no animals, no rustling leaves. Just the thick weight of the dark pressing in from all sides. His fingers dug into the bark of a nearby tree, grounding himself, and then he heard it, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The rustling of footsteps on leaves, the lightest crunch of twigs breaking underfoot. It was close now, too close. His breath quickened. He turned his head, scanning the inky blackness. A flash of movement, just at the edge of his vision. His heart skipped a beat. There it was, the thing, the creature, the one that had been following him, the one that had whispered his name. It was towering, its shape barely discernible in the shadows, but its eyes, glowing faintly, like the reflection of fire in pitch-black night, were unmistakable. And it was watching him. The world around him felt like it was collapsing inward, the trees pressing in as if to suffocate him. The thing's gaze locked onto his, and the air between them seemed to hum with a strange energy, a primal pull. He knew it. It knew him. "You can't run from me, Daniel," the voice rasped, its tone twisted, distorted. It was no longer a whisper. It was a command. "You are mine." A chill swept down his spine, colder than anything he had ever felt. The voice, it was wrong, not human. It was deeper now, layered with voices, a chorus of the damned. And yet, in the back of his mind, a horrible realization gnawed at him. It wasn't just hunting him. It was calling him. He backed away, his legs trembling beneath him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet were frozen. The creature's voice surged again, echoing inside his skull, each word a claw digging deeper. "You are mine. I am in you. I am everything you fear." He closed his eyes, trying to block out the voice, trying to shake the terror that was taking root in his mind. but it was impossible. It was in him now. Part of him. No! He shouted at the darkness, his voice hoarse, raw with the strain of holding back the wave of panic that threatened to drown him. He had to fight it. He had to. A movement. A sound. Behind him. A snap. Too late. Before he could turn, the creature's long, twisted limbs were upon him. Cold, unnaturally strong hands wrapped around his throat, lifting him from the ground as if he weighed nothing. Daniel gasped, his vision blurring as he struggled against the grip, his breath a series of desperate, strangled gasps. The thing leaned in, its putrid breath hot against his ear. It whispered again, its voice like claws scraping against his mind, dragging him down into the depths of madness. You never should have come here, Daniel. This place, this forest is mine. And now you are mine. With a strength born of desperation, Daniel reached out, his hands flailing for anything. And then, by some miracle, his fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. His flashlight. It had fallen, hidden in the dirt. His heart skipped. Grabbing it, he turned it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, but for a brief, fleeting moment, the light caught something else, a reflection in the creature's eyes. The cabin. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. The cabin. The place he had come from. The place where this had all started. It's not over. With a surge of adrenaline, Daniel slammed the flashlight into the creature's face. The creature hissed, recoiling from the bright light, its grip loosening just enough for him to break free. He scrambled to his feet, stumbling toward the darkness, away from the creature that was now shrieking in fury. The light from the flashlight flickered erratically, barely illuminating his path, but it was enough to guide him, to keep the thing at bay. It was weaker in the light. Daniel ran with everything he had left, tearing through the forest, not looking back. His breath was ragged, each step a painful struggle, but he kept moving. The flashlight flickered out again, and then, ahead, there it was, the ranger station, his salvation. As he reached the door, he slammed his hand against the handle, throwing himself inside. The door slammed shut behind him, the world outside dark and silent once again. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his body shaking violently. He was safe, at least for now. The whispers were gone, but he knew deep down that it wasn't over. The thing was still out there, waiting, and Daniel was marked. It would never let him go. Never. The Ozarks had always been Colton's home. As a park ranger, he'd spent most of his adult life walking its vast, rugged terrain, understanding its every twist, every tree, every creek that cut through the dense woods. There was something calming about the isolation, the quiet hum of nature that surrounded him. But lately, the quiet was different. It was hollow, unsettling. For the past couple of months, several groups of campers had gone missing without a trace. The reports all came in the same way. People went out on their hiking trips or set up campsites, only for their tents to be found abandoned, gear scattered, and no sign of the people who'd been there. Authorities believed it was a human predator, someone hunting campers for reasons unknown, but Colton wasn't convinced. As much as he didn't want to admit it, his experience in the Ozarks told him it wasn't just another killer on the loose. He had a feeling, an intuition, that this was something darker, something supernatural. He had heard whispers from the old-timers who lived around the park, old folk tales about the spirits of the Ozarks, about things that should never be disturbed, and he couldn't shake the thought that they weren't just stories. The park they were investigating was Buffalo National River, a place few ventured deep into, save for the most experienced outdoorsmen. The area was known for its steep bluffs, thick forests, and winding rivers that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. The rangers had tried everything, organizing search teams, setting up traps, and even enlisting the help of local hunters. But all they found were abandoned campsites and eerie signs of something stalking them, something that had been watching. Colton, a seasoned ranger, had been the one to push for a deeper investigation, insisting there was more to these disappearances than a human could explain. It wasn't just the missing campers. It was the way they disappeared, the way they were taken, the strange sounds that had been reported, the low growls in the night that seemed to echo off the hills. Colton knew the sounds of wild animals. This wasn't that. After several weeks without finding any solid clues, he was assigned to take the lead on the latest search. The families of the missing people were desperate for answers, but the truth was, Colton didn't know what kind of answer to give. All he could do was follow his instincts and the faint, flickering thread of evidence that suggested something far more sinister was lurking in the park. The sun was beginning to set as Colton arrived at one of the campsites, where the most recent group had been reported missing. The forest was already dimming, but the overcast sky blocked out most of the light, casting the park in a near-perpetual twilight. He stood at the edge of the campsite, examining the area with a practiced eye. The tents were still there, though half collapsed. The campsite looked as though it had been abandoned in haste, but everything seemed off. There were footprints, but they were odd. Instead of normal human tracks, they were too deep, almost like something heavy had walked through. And they weren't following a clear path. They spiraled, scattered in different directions, before disappearing into the underbrush. Colton's stomach churned. Something wasn't right. He knelt down, inspecting the scattered gear. One of the backpacks had been torn open, its contents scattered across the ground, and yet there was no sign of struggle, no blood, no sign of anyone having fought back, just an eerie quiet. The faint smell of burning wood still lingered in the air, suggesting the fire had recently died. There was an unease to the stillness, a silence that felt suffocating. As Colton sifted through the belongings, his heart skipped a beat. In the midst of the scattered supplies was a camera, an old, dusty model, probably belonging to one of the missing campers. He picked it up cautiously, noting that the lens was cracked, as if it had been dropped or smashed in a hurry. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned it on, praying it wasn't just another useless item that had been abandoned in panic. The screen flickered to life. The first image that flashed up was a blurry shot of the campsite, probably taken earlier in the day. The second image was a picture of the woods, taken from within the trees. But the third picture made Colton freeze in place. It was a dark figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the woods, watching the campsite from just behind the trees. The figure was tall, but its shape was unnatural. It didn't seem to belong in the photo, like it had been captured at the wrong angle, out of sync with the surroundings. Colton's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew that feeling, the feeling of being watched. He turned the camera off, but his mind kept racing. He had heard stories from other rangers who had worked here before, about something dark that lingered in the forest, something that didn't let people leave. They had always chalked it up to old superstitions. But this was something different, something worse. The missing campers hadn't just vanished, they had been taken. And Colton wasn't sure he'd be able to find out why before whatever it was that had claimed them came for him next. The sun dipped below the tree line, casting the forest in a muted twilight glow. Colton's breath was steady, but the uneasy sensation that had been crawling up his spine for the past few weeks began to settle deeper into his chest. As he carefully examined the campsite, the hair on the back of his neck prickled, and the silence felt heavy, unnatural. Every step seemed to echo through the trees, amplifying the stillness around him. He pushed the feeling aside. This was just another day in the wilderness, another case to solve. The camera in his hand felt heavier as he turned it over, still lost in the blurry image of the dark figure. The woods had always had a way of playing tricks on people. He'd heard rumors from the locals about shadowy figures and strange sightings in the park, but he never gave much credence to old stories. Not until now. He heard something then, a sound faint enough to be mistaken for the wind, but it came from the direction of the trees. A rustle, a scraping noise, like dry branches being twisted. His hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across his back, and he scanned the woods, but saw nothing. Colton wasn't new to this job. He knew the dangers that came with it, especially in an area as wild and remote as Buffalo National River. But this was different. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It was something wrong. The wind picked up, and the rustling sound grew louder, coming from all around him now. It seemed to shift, like something circling, closing in. Colton's eyes flicked back to the camp, his heart hammering in his chest. The campsite was still empty, but the hairs on his arms stood on end. That's when he noticed it. A trail of broken branches leading into the woods. It wasn't just the kind of disruption an animal might cause. These branches were snapped at unnatural angles, some of them ripped clean from the trees. Someone, or something, had been through here recently, but it wasn't human. The footprints that followed weren't animal tracks either. They were too deep, too wide, too erratic. The pattern suggested something far larger, something that moved with purpose, but without concern for leaving clear traces. Colton swallowed hard, his instincts kicking into overdrive. He had seen these signs before, but never here, never so close to home. His father had spoken of creatures like this when Colton was younger. Things from the folklore of the Ozarks. He dismissed it at the time, but now, in the heart of these woods, the stories seemed all too real. He continued following the trail, his footsteps now slow and deliberate, his mind racing. The sounds around him shifted once more, and his eyes darted to the trees. He could feel it. Something watching him. Something tracking his every move. His breath was shallow as he moved deeper into the woods, keeping his senses alert. The trail led him to a clearing. The trees here were gnarled, twisted like the bones of some long-dead creature. At first he thought it was just an oddly shaped tree, but as he got closer, he realized that the object wasn't natural. It was a human limb. A severed arm, torn clean from the body, its flesh pale and mangled, with claw-like marks running through the bone. Colton recoiled, his stomach churning. The air felt thick, heavier now, as if something was closing in around him. His eyes scanned the rest of the clearing, his senses on high alert. The arm wasn't the only thing here. There were scraps of torn clothing scattered in the underbrush, a torn backpack hanging from the side of a low-hanging branch. Colton recognized it immediately. It was one of the missing campers' packs. His breath caught in his throat. He crouched down to inspect the area, the eerie stillness surrounding him. The ground was soft, the soil disturbed, but there were no signs of struggle, no sign that the campers had fought back or tried to escape. Everything was too calm, too quiet. And then, as if the air itself was holding its breath, a sound rang out from the trees. A low, guttural growl. It didn't come from a bear. It didn't come from a mountain lion. This sound was deep, resonating through the trees like an ancient warning. Colton's heart leapt into his throat. The growl was followed by a snap of branches, and in the distance, a shadow moved. So fast, too fast for an animal. Colton's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. The forest was closing in. Something was out there, and it was drawing closer. Colton wasn't sure how much longer he could stay calm, but he couldn't afford to panic. Not now. Not when he was this close. He rose to his feet, quickly scanning the trees. He needed to get out of this clearing. But before he could turn around, He heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate, and heavy. The hairs on his neck stood up, and his blood ran cold. He wasn't alone anymore. The creature was here, and it was closer than ever. The moment Colton turned, he knew something had changed. The air felt thick, saturated with an unnatural heaviness that pressed down on his chest. His heart hammered in his ears, and the growling that had echoed through the woods now seemed to reverberate inside his skull. Every instinct he had as a ranger screamed at him to run, to flee back to the campsite and call for backup, but his legs refused to move. His body locked in place, frozen by the sheer magnitude of the presence now stalking him. The footsteps came closer, and with them a sense of impending doom. They were heavy, deliberate, like the footfalls of something that had been walking these woods for centuries. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot. It wasn't just a predator. It was hunting him. Colton's hand slid to his side, fingers brushing the cold metal of his sidearm. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't help him. The stories his father had told him, the warnings from the old-timers, none of it had seemed real. But now, as he stood in the middle of the Ozarks with something massive closing in on him, those stories became his only truth. He wasn't up against a man or a wild animal. This was something else. Something ancient. The growl came again, louder this time, like a warning. It was no longer behind him. It was in front of him. Colton slowly raised his head, his breath shallow, his pulse racing as he scanned the trees. The light had dimmed further, and the woods seemed to close in, the shadows stretching long and dark. And then he saw it. At first it was just a silhouette, a dark shape blending into the trees, so tall it seemed to touch the canopy. The creature's form was massive, covered in fur, its movements unsettlingly smooth, like it was both part of the forest and completely separate from it. Its eyes, Colton would never forget them, glowed an unnatural yellow, piercing through the dim light like twin lanterns in the dark. The eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. It was studying him, watching him, as though it were weighing his worth. Colton's mouth went dry. The figure took a step forward, its long limbs impossibly long and twisted. It wasn't like anything he had seen before. Not a bear, not a Bigfoot. No, this was something far older. It moved with an eerie, gliding motion, as if it were floating just above the ground, its feet never quite touching the earth. Its fur, matted and coarse, looked almost like the skin of something ancient, something that had lived through the ages and had learned how to hide in plain sight. Colton's hand clenched around his weapon, but he knew he was powerless. There was no way to outrun it, no way to fight it. The creature took another step, and this time Colton could hear the low, rattling growl deep within its chest. The ground seemed to vibrate, and a feeling of dread washed over him, almost as if the very air was being suffocated by the creature's presence. It stepped closer still, its movements fluid and unnatural. Colton could see it now. Its face was twisted, grotesque, a mix of human and something else. Its features seemed to shift with every glance, never quite settling into one form. The longer he looked, the more he felt his sanity slipping, as if the creature was warping his perception, pulling him into its nightmarish world. He tried to look away, but he couldn't. The eyes held him there. Suddenly it spoke, or at least he thought it did. A voice, guttural and deep, rumbled through the air, reverberating inside his skull. The words were unintelligible, a series of hisses and growls that made no sense. But the meaning was clear. It wasn't interested in him, not yet. It was toying with him. And then the creature lunged. It wasn't like the movies, where monsters move slowly and with purpose. No, this was fast, unnaturally fast. Colton didn't have time to react. The creature's massive claws reached out for him, and he dove to the side, barely managing to avoid its swipe. The ground beneath him shook as the thing crashed into the trees, sending a shower of splintered wood flying into the air. Colton scrambled to his feet, adrenaline flooding his body as his training kicked in. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He ran. His legs burned, his breath ragged, but he pushed himself forward, tearing through the underbrush, his mind racing. He didn't know where he was going, just that he had to get away. His only thought was survival. The sound of the creature behind him was deafening now, its growls and crashes echoing through the forest, each step sending a wave of fear through him. He could hear it getting closer. He could feel it, right behind him, almost at his heels. A scream built up in his throat, but it never came. The woods were too alive with noise, too full of the creature's presence. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The growling faded. The crashes of the creature's pursuit silenced. Colton slowed, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He dared to look back. The forest around him was still, too still. He couldn't hear a thing, couldn't see a trace of the creature. It was as if it had vanished. But Colton knew better. Whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. And he was no longer sure if he would ever leave these woods alive. Colton's pulse slowed, but the dread still clung to him. The woods had swallowed him whole, and now, as the silence pressed in from all sides, he couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body slick with sweat despite the chill that had settled in the air. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the brush sent his heart racing, but when he turned to look, the forest was just as still as it had been moments before. He stumbled forward, heart hammering in his chest, unsure of where he was headed anymore. His only thought was to get out, to escape the suffocating grip of the woods, but the longer he ran, the more disoriented he became. The trees seemed to twist in on themselves, the trail he had followed vanishing with each step. The path was gone. He'd seen the creature, felt its claws just inches away. And yet now, there was nothing. Nothing but the eerie stillness of the night. It was almost as if the forest itself had swallowed him up, and he was no longer in control of his own fate. The camp, his only point of orientation, was still miles away. Colton knew he couldn't make it back to the ranger station, not like this, not after what he had witnessed. But the thought of staying in these woods lost and alone was even worse. He found a small rock outcrop by a stream and collapsed against it, exhaustion weighing down on him. For a moment, he closed his eyes, just trying to catch his breath, to let the pounding in his head settle. But sleep didn't come. He could still feel the creature's eyes on him, and he could still hear its growls echoing in his ears. His mind replayed the events over and over, but it was starting to blur. Everything felt distant and unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. As he sat there, the silence returned, thick and oppressive. Colton's eyes fluttered open, his senses alert. That's when he saw it, just beyond the edge of his vision, a flicker of movement. A shadow. No, not a shadow. A figure, standing just inside the tree line watching him. He froze. His body tensed, every muscle screaming to run, but he couldn't move. The figure didn't move either. It stood motionless, its outline barely discernible in the fading light. Colton's breath caught in his throat. Could it be the creature again? Was this some twisted game, some cruel trick of the mind? His hand went to his sidearm, but he stopped himself. There was no point. He already knew. His father's warnings, the stories from the old-timers, they had all been true. The creature, whatever it was, didn't play by the rules. It didn't care about guns or traps or anything human. It was a part of the land, older than the trees themselves, and it could disappear as easily as it appeared. The figure slowly took a step forward. Colton could see it clearer now, but his mind refused to process what it was. The outline, the shape, it was almost human, yet far too tall, too hunched, and far too unnatural. The figure's face, there was no face. It was an empty void, just a blur of darkness where eyes should have been. Then it spoke, not with words, but with a sound. A voice, but not a voice. An echo that reverberated in Colton's skull. A voice that rattled his very core. A whisper of something too old to comprehend. You were never meant to leave. The words weren't spoken aloud, but Colton heard them, felt them, deep inside his bones. The figure took another step forward, and Colton knew, without a doubt, that it was coming for him. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Not a single trace. The trees were still, the night too quiet. The rustle of the wind in the leaves was the only sound now, but it wasn't comforting. It was hollow, as though the forest itself had died, leaving nothing behind but an echo of its former self. Colton didn't know what happened next. His eyes grew heavy, and the darkness around him seemed to close in, swallowing him whole. The last thing he remembered was the snap of twigs underfoot. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if the creature was circling. And then, the world went black. When Colton awoke, the sun was rising, casting a dull orange light through the trees. His head throbbed, his body aching, but there was no sign of the creature, no sign of the forest's twisted horror. For a moment, he thought maybe it had all been a dream, a terrible, fevered dream. But then he saw the gear. Scattered across the forest floor, just beyond the rock outcrop, were the belongings of the missing campers, packs, jackets, a half-burned fire pit. The same items Colton had seen at the previous campsite. But there were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, just the abandoned gear, scattered as if left in a hurry. Colton's chest tightened. He stood, unsteady, and stumbled toward the items. His breath hitched as his hands trembled, picking up a jacket. It was the same as the one worn by one of the missing campers, yet there was no body to go with it, no trace of where they had gone or why. He looked around, his heart sinking. The woods were still. The trees stood as silent sentinels, guarding the secrets that Colton would never understand. And then, just as he turned to leave, he heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. The sound of heavy breathing behind him, and the low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate in his chest. Colton froze. The forest had not given him answers. It had only given him a taste of the terror that still lurked within its depths. And somewhere, deep within those woods, the creature waited,